if I may have your attention, so we have, as specified on the syllabus, and I don't remember if I told you last week, we have a guest lecturer this week for the first 10-15 minutes. So Andrew Nicholson, who for those of you who are not geography majors, minor, or anything, is the liaison librarian for geography. So I told you last week that because this is a second year course, I insist on the book review. So a few of you have already contacted me regarding potential choices. But the thing about books, as I was telling you last week, is that you will need to consult the opinion of experts in order to write your critical section. And the best way to see what experts have said about a particular book is to find find credible, legitimate book reviews about that particular book. So this is what Andrew is here to tell you about. Please don't panic. For once, the PowerPoint slides will be posted, so please sit back, relax, listen, learn. And again, the slides will be posted in maybe 48 hours. So Andrew, up to you.
Okay. Hey, many thanks to Professor DeRoche. So, what I've done here is I've in my slides I've got some screenshots, basically showing you the steps of how to access the book review indexes available online, and also use the Summon database, which is kind of the U of T's answer to Google Scholar, to find book reviews through there as well. So there's a number of different options for finding the credible reviews that Professor DeRoche is looking for. But before I get into reviews, I want to tell you about how you can find books through the U of T catalog. So what you would do is you would go to the UTM Library website, and if you went into the library and opened up any kind of browser, the library website will come up as a default, and then of course on your own laptop you can Google it. And from the website you'll find that there's a section up here for the catalog. So I don't recommend you just putting any kind of search terms in there right away. What I would do is I'd go to the catalog and go to select the books option, and this page will open up here for searching the catalog, and this is where you will put in your keywords. So I'm kind of pretending I'm a student in the course, so I'm looking up, I want to see what books the University of Toronto Libraries has on globalization and trade. And so when you'll see here, I'm putting trade and global, so and is like a connecting word between the keywords, and I put a little star at the end. That star is like a wildcard symbol. This will pick up all the books which have global, globalization, globalize, any variations of the word global, and its sort of variants of the meaning in the catalog. So we'll search for the title, any table of contents that are online, and so forth. And I'm also searching under the anywhere, so it's kind of like a keyword option. And so I do the search, and then I pull up over 1,900 titles. So when this is searching not just the UTM library, it's searching all of the 25 or so University of Toronto libraries in the system. And you can, some of you may already know this, I'm not sure, but you can get books from the St. George campus very easily. So if you see a book in here which we don't have at UTM, you can get it from downtown. You can request it through the catalog option with your T-card, and it comes out here really quickly, and it's free. So usually within 2 business days, but I often find even sooner than that, and you can pick it up in the UTM library. Anyway, so I do my search here, and let's say I want to get books from the UTM library. So on the left-hand side, there's like a facet or filter where you can select the books that are just held at UTM. And so I found a book here called Global Shift, Mapping the Changing Contours of the World Economy by Peter Dicken. And this is the 7th edition, and you'll see this is what a catalog record will look like when you do a search and you pull up a book you're interested in perhaps reading. And so you'll see that it indicates locations in the U of T library system. So in this case, there's a copy at the U of T Mississauga, and when it says stacks, that means it is being held in the library at this moment, and you'll see that there's a call number right next to stacks. The books are on the 3rd and 4th floor, so this one is an HD call number, so this will be on the 3rd floor. So I can just write down the call number, and I can go up to the shelf and pull it off the shelf and have a look at the book and decide if I want to include it or not. And so I'm going to use that book now for my reviews. I've again, pretending I'm in the class, I've emailed Professor DeRoche and he's approved it. So I'm now ready to go and look for book reviews. So before I get into actual book review indexes, I just wanted to kind of point out a couple things to think about when you're searching for reviews. So as the professor was saying, you want to go for the credible reviews. Those are that have been vetted by experts before publication. So you want to look at the source of the review. So ideally, you want to try and get reviews that are from a scholarly, peer-reviewed journal. So these are journals that have a committee of peers that vet the articles, vet the reviews before publication. If you have trouble getting the reviews from those places, you can also look at reviews from specialized magazines or professional websites. Really anything where there's some vetting that's taking place. So it's not just somebody writing a review and then putting it on their personal website. What a professional website might do is somebody might write a review, and then the editor of the website will look over the review and decide whether they want to publish it on their professional website. So there's a vetting process that takes place. So avoiding reviews from personal websites, blogs, social media. You don't want to use those reviews. They're not going to count. Maybe some of the arguments might be interesting, but they're not going to count towards those four reviews that you need. So that's the source of the review, thinking about the source of the reviews. Then looking at the authors of the reviews. So say you find a bunch of reviews. You want to look at who's written the review. So is that person an expert in the field? So at the bottom of the review, often there should be the name of the reviewer. And I find it very valuable. I know students in the past find it valuable to just get some background on the person. Like, are they indeed an expert in the field? You might discover that they're a friend or colleague of that book's author. They may be a regular critic of the author of that viewpoint. Just doing a bit of background searching, putting their name in the search engine, and just getting some information about them. Many cases, the reviewers will be researchers. They'll be experts. They'll have their own research website at their institution, and you can look up their research very easily, so you can find out some information about them. Okay, so now the edition of the book. So the edition that I'm looking at of the Global Shift book is the seventh edition. So this is something that's important too. So when you find your book, you want to just check to see, is it a first edition or is it going to be a later edition? Sometimes it may be a second, third, fourth, fifth edition, even later than that. You just may find reviews for earlier editions. That's okay, but you want to make sure that you indicate that in your essay. Maybe check with Professor DeRoche as well. Oftentimes the newer editions will come out, and all they will have changed is maybe a new introduction. Sometimes there's no changes at all. They just reprinted it and they just put a new number on the book. So you just want to I wouldn't be put off by if you can only find reviews for earlier editions, but you just want to indicate that these are reviews for earlier editions of the book. And also the year the book was published too. This is actually quite important. I recommend you try and use a book that's at least a couple of years old, if not older, just because if you get like a brand new book, it takes a little while for reviews to appear in the index, in the databases, in the literature that you're going to be getting reviews from. Just because the publishing cycle can take a little while. Book can be published, and then it takes a while for the book to then get out to reviewers, for people to write a review, and then for the reviews to be peer reviewed or critiqued and then published. So it takes a little while. It can be a year or even more. So my example here, a book published in 2014, you might only see reviews start to appear in 2015 or even later. So if you decide to take a book published in 2017, it's probably not going to be any reviews, and so you may be asked to pick a different book, an older book. So I'm just kind of letting you know that now. So when you're looking, maybe try and get something maybe a couple years old at least, if not older. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about just a few of the book review resources that we have. So the first one is the Book Review Index Online, and talk about Book Review Digest, and then Summon, which is the library database. So like I say, I'm going to be looking at Global Shift. Now, where can you find those links to those book review indexes? And we recently changed our website. So what I've done is, for the course, is if you go to the library website, if you kind of scroll down, you'll see under starting points, there's a link to geography. And if you click on the geography link, you'll see that there's a tab here for geography resources. And if you open that up, I've got a link here for finding book reviews. And this is where I put the links for book review, the book review indexes, and a few other links as well, which I won't talk about today, but you're welcome to explore. You're welcome to take a look at. That might help you for your essay as well. So first one here, book review index. So I'm going to go in here, and the link will come up, and then very simple. You just put in the title of the book that you're looking at, and so when you do that, hopefully you'll get a whole bunch of reviews will then appear. And so I put in my title, and I got 29 reviews from academic journals, which is great. Sometimes now, if you get way too many, you can always go over here. You can limit the search to peer-reviewed journals. So, and those are the most credible reviews that you're going to want to use. And then what you can do is, once you get your list of reviews here, you can click on the Get It option, which ties into the U of T library databases, and you'll be able to pull up the review full text, and then you've got your review here, and you can go through it. So fairly straightforward. Then there's the Book Review Digest Plus, again, very similar type of search, just a different interface. If you put in the book title, do a search, and then you may want to limit the search over here. There's a book review articles. You can just select that, and then that will take out all the non-book review material that's there, and you'll just have your book reviews that you can go through. And then finally, the third one I just wanted to mention is Summon, which is essentially what you'll see when you go to the U of T Library website. And you remember before at the beginning I was talking about the catalog. Well, this time when you're looking for reviews, I go by articles and go to the advanced search. And then in here, what I've done is I put in the title of the book, and then because there's all kinds of databases hooked into the website, I also selected the author last name too, just to kind of filter out, just to kind of get a more specific search. And then most importantly, under formats, you can select book review over here, and then when you do that, you'll then pull up just the book reviews for that particular title. So I got a huge amount here, which is great, 817, and it will actually tell you in the record, so it says book review, and then we can go in and look at the full text for those. Now, how do you know whether it's a peer-reviewed journal or not when you're sort of going through there? There's a number of kind of tips and tricks. One of them I'll talk about here. So you can go, if you click on, when you pull up the book review record here, so this is a book review in economic geography for my book Global Shift. If you click on the more options and then go down the page, you'll see it'll actually tell you peer-reviewed, yes. And then if you still want to be sure, if you go to Ulrichs, and Ulrichs is like a database of all is a directory of all the different journals published in the world, and this will tell you whether it's actually refereed. You'll see there's like a little refereed shirt there, and once you see that, you know that this review from the economic geography journal is in fact from a peer-reviewed source. So that means this review is going to be excellent. It's going to be good to use. Also, a very good indicator of a peer-reviewed or a refereed review. Peer-reviewed means the same thing as, refereed means the same thing as peer-reviewed. Is when the reviewer name and their research affiliations included at the end of the review, sometimes at the beginning, but usually the end. So in this case, Dr. Zhang, who in 2011 was at the National University of Singapore, his name appears at the end of the review, so he wrote this review. And actually, just before the class today, I just did a little background check on him and did a search for him, and turned out he's actually now at U of T, but all of his sort of research writings and so forth are up there, and his whole kind of research history and so forth. So, you know, I could establish that he has some knowledge in the field. So, with that, are there any questions?
Okay, so Andrew, when will you be available? But please try to do everything on your own first, but if you're really desperate and hopefully not 24 hours before the deadline, where can they find you?
They can find me in the library. I'm here most days, Monday through Friday, but the best way to get a hold of me is to send me an email. My email address up there, and I will reply usually within 24 hours. And from there, we can set up an appointment to meet. But please, before you contact me, go through all of the steps I've talked about in the slides, because that would be the first thing I ask you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Okay, go on.
Well, what's he doing here? Oh, maybe I went too fast here. So I told you last week that we would go over the questions briefly to let you know what you're expected to do. So again, you know how to find the course syllabus. You go on my personal webpage, you click on courses, look at economic geography. The questions are at two or three different places on the syllabus, but the easiest way is to just click on tests. You'll see a link to questions appearing. And you will see that I have posted only 2 questions because last week was the introduction. Okay, so let's look at the first one. So summarize 1 sentence each the 4 interrelated objectives of economic geography according to Hayter and Batchel. So the answer there is at the beginning of the chapter. Hayter and Batchel says economic geography has 4 objectives. For each one of them, they have a little paragraph, but all I want there is the first sentence where they summarize the content of the paragraph. Okay, so 4 bullet points for that. According to Poon, what are the 2 main ways in which institutions shape economic action? Who is Poon? Again, remember I told you that you have the textbook, but before you tell me, well, I've looked everywhere in the textbook and there is no Poon. Well, that's because you have other stuff to read. Whoops. So you look at lecture 1, what do I see? Well, apart from mandatory readings from the textbook, there's also a fellow named Poon here. You click on it. It's a normal website, it should open. Now the thing with Poon is that there's a bit of a trick here. You might think that the text is only 2 paragraphs, because as soon as you're done with general overview, you have bibliography. But no, it's a trick there. There's more text below, and the answer really is towards the end. I won't give it to you, but it's in one of those block of text when you scroll down the text from Poon. Again, short bullet points, keep it simple. This is not rocket science, that's all I want. The third part of the question is, according to a fellow named Parag Khanna, what should geographers and others focus on rather than the boundaries of sovereign nations and nation states? Again, this is not from the textbook, but if you just look for the name of the author, sometimes you won't even see it among the mandatory readings. So it might be that one of those readings quotes this person. So this is my not so subtle way to force you to read everything, and you'll find the answer eventually. But again, remember, the questions are based on stuff that I show you in class, which will not be in the readings. On the textbook, and also on the other mandatory readings, some of which will quote other authors. So if you think that, well, it's easy, I'll just look for the name of the author of the column. No, sometimes I do deliberately lift a quote from somebody who's not the main author of the text to force you to read this stuff. Okay, so again, that's all I want. 4 bullet points, 2 bullet points, 1 short bullet point. That's your question 1. You have a few weeks to prepare it and memorize the stuff. And again, you will have roughly 20 questions to prepare for the term test, and I will ask you half of those. Okay? Good. Okay, now I'll be honest with you. The first lectures this week and next week are a bit boring because what happens, or more boring than usual, what the authors do in the first 3 chapters is that they throw a bunch of concepts at you. They want to make sure that you understand what are economies of scale, what are agglomeration economies, and once you've understood these concepts, then they will begin to discuss more interesting stuff. But in order to make the lectures a little bit less boring, I've added a few videos and a few additional examples. So I will go quickly over basic concepts because they're defined in the textbook. If you look within the margin of each page, the authors tend to say, well, economies of scopes are blah, blah, blah. And so this is what I will expect you to come up with if I ask you a question. If I say define concisely economies of scope, look within the margin of the textbook. But then I've added other stuff in the lecture today that is not in the textbook. So this is where I will slow down, or else we will watch video and I will try to tell you what you need to remember from the videos at the end of you watching them. There will also be questions on the videos, so once I've shown them to you, I'll try to ask you, or I'll try to tell you what was the key insight there. So let me go quickly over the basic concept. There's no point even trying to take pictures of that because I will ask you the questions from the textbook, and I will go slower with the other material, and so that way the lecture should be both more informative and hopefully slightly more entertaining. Okay? So the authors begin chapter 1 by telling you about the way economic activity is organized. And in an economy like Canada, and well, to be honest, pretty much every economy on earth, save a few exceptions like North Korea and Cuba, and then for Cuba, who knows for how long, markets, meaning voluntary transactions between people, but in systems where governments regulate and tax and mandate and forbid stuff, markets, so voluntary transactions between people are what really determine what is manufactured, what is sold, where things are distributed, how they're moved over space. So again, guys, no need to write down everything, trust me, there's a lot of material, I'll tell you what really matters. So the authors go, or at least define 3 types of market, open, administered, and relational. They then, being economic geographer, discuss how economic activities takes place over geographical space. So it's not only about buying and selling, it's in the abstract, it's about how economic activity spontaneously develops patterns of outcome over geographical space. And they insist mostly on agglomeration. Why is it that economic activities tend to cluster over space? Why is it, for example, that most people in Ontario live in the GTA and the rest of the province is mostly empty? And value chains, so different steps of manufacturing a product, how are these things organized and how do they emerge over space? Then they discuss market governance, so how do business interact with each other, how do government regulate business, and why do we have property rights? And why is the absence of property rights a problem if you want to organize economic activity somewhat rationally? Now, markets have a lot of good, but they also have a lot of features that have been critiqued by a number of people. And so we will discuss, hopefully today, if not next week, market failure, sustainable development, and countervailing powers, which are some of the main critiques that have been addressed to markets and which are the ones at any rate that the authors I've chosen to emphasize. Okay, how many of you have taken Econ 101 or whatever it's called here? Okay, so bear with me here. I know this will be stuff that you're already familiar with, but I cannot assume that everyone knows the basic foundations of a market economy. Okay, so economists like to deal with a simple model to introduce some basic ideas. Now, these models are obviously abstraction. The world is, we can all agree, more complex, but at least if you understand some basic ideas, you can then introduce additional complexities later on. So what economists typically tend to do, and I assume that my colleagues here are no different, although I guess you took your class from Lee Bailey, right? I should have, okay. I should have asked him. We've introduced this stuff. Sorry, it's kind of things that are obvious after the fact. So a perfect competition assumes a market that is quote-unquote ideal in three respects. So you have a large numbers of sellers and buyers. You assume that people are free to do what they want with what they own, including their labor. So you're not forced to buy something from somebody, you're not forced to sell your stuff to somebody, and you're not in a position to impose your will on other people or to have other people impose your will on you. So you only decide, even if you're a lowly student who works part-time on the weekend, if your manager at McDonald's or at Square One doesn't want to pay you, you always have recourse against that person. So there's no real discrepancy in power. If you sign a contract, if you agree to show up, do the work, you should get paid, even though you don't have much power within our economic system. We also assume that most people are self-interested, and by that I do not necessarily mean selfish, but let's face it, we tend to do things that benefit us before they benefit others, and so you seek to maximize the benefits that you get out of any transaction, or at least not to feel any additional pain compared to what you had at the beginning. Now, within this context, if the price of any given good goes up, producers have an incentive to produce more of it. If the price of a good that is in high demand goes down, consumers tend to buy more of it. And through these market transactions, the prices eventually reach where the stuff is produced at a price that allows the market to clear, meaning that there won't be any surplus or leftovers on the market. Okay, so again, this is how economists typically present these ideas. So the more a good that is sought after becomes expensive, the more producers will want to offer of it on the market. The cheaper it is, the more consumers will want to buy that certain good. And there is, at one point, a price at which the quantity offered and the quantity demanded intersect with each other, and this is the market clearing price. So I won't really quiz you on that. I assume that most of you were familiar with this, but this is, if not the first, the second lecture of Econ 101. But this is a geography course, so we go beyond that and we look at how these things happen in the real world. So the standard example, or at least the one that geographers use to highlight, is the Tsukiji Fish Market in Tokyo. Now, they're in the process, if they haven't already done so, of going electronic, but I was there a few years ago, and that's pretty spectacular. So basically, the Japanese are the biggest fish eaters in the world. They have a lot of money. They're willing to pay more for good quality fish than other people. And so there is one warehouse in the market where fishermen from all over Japan and other parts of the world bring the best quality tuna. They put samples on the floor, and people examine it, and then the bell rings and they start bidding on it. So that's pretty much as close to a perfect market as you can get. So this is a little video here to make supply and demand a bit easier to understand, or at least less theoretical.
It's like 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm heading to the fish market. Let's see if I get a rest to get in.
Are you ready?
So the nice thing about Japanese is that they're very civilized. That way you can have sushi and beer for breakfast. And trust me, when you've showed up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you get there at 7:30, you're in the mood for sushi and beer. So anyway, I was. Okay. So, can take my word for this every day. The beauty of supply and demand is that there's never any fish left on the floor. You know, the price will always be low enough at the end of the auction to make sure that the whole thing clears. And so you've got professional buyers who know exactly what to look for and the best quality tuna you'll find on the planet. You've got fishermen who will wait to be paid at the end of this, and you've got the person in the middle that manages the auction. Okay, but I'm gonna quiz you on stuff that is not in the textbook, so this is the first thing that I will ask you to remember. Something simple, but if you're not already familiar with this, there are actually different types of auctions. So what you saw there is a model of what is commonly referred to as an English auction. So basically the stuff is presented to an audience of bidders. You've got somebody in charge, and you let people bid each other up. So you say, who wants to buy my gym bag, let's say they get 25 cents, because it's really like 15 years old, maybe nobody, or maybe somebody will make an offer at 25, then 26, 35 cents, whatever. Okay, the thing is the price goes up, and once the peak is reached, then whoever made the highest bid will get to walk out of here with my bag. So the item is sold to the highest bidder. Now the sealed bid auction is something slightly different. You often see that in charity galas or something like that. So the items are again on display. The bidders will submit bids in an envelope or some other means by which other bidders cannot see the price that the bidder has offered. And the item is again sold to the highest bidder. And then you've got the Dutch auction. So again, the items are displayed. The price is set typically deliberately too high. And then the price goes down in increments. And the first person that bids gets to purchase whatever was on display. So let's say that I have a painting here, it's offered to you for $1,000. Nobody's interested, but I'll say, okay, we'll give me $950, we'll give me $900, we'll give me $850. And the first person that raises their hand, the first bidder that raises his or her hands will get the item. Okay, so markets work in different ways. Now, what happened over time is that people didn't like to bid all that much, and so the structure that we have in retail markets or in terms of online shopping emerged. So when there's a given price, take it or leave it. But of course, as some of you know, you can still bid on a number of things, either online or in person at various kinds of auctions. Okay, so English, seal bid, and Dutch. So if I ask you, describe summarily the three main types of auctions, this is what I want. English, seal bid, and Dutch, and then a few words to describe each. Okay? Now, another difference between economic geographers and economists is that we then apply those basic laws of supply and demand. We assume that the land is flat, that it's the same everywhere, and we theorize how rational economic actors will come to occupy the land. So the perfect competition models assume that all consumers and suppliers are, this is back from the textbook, so that's why I'm going faster. What happens in the real world, the difference, or let's say the difference between an economic geography textbook and a standard economic textbook is that we assume that transportation costs do exist, and that there is a cost to business over space, and that transportation cost, if nothing else, will lead to a dispersal of economic activities over the land. So the real price of a good must obviously include transportation costs, and this takes two forms. Either consumers that need to access the market to go get their stuff, or else even if you order something online, there is a delivery cost. And if you want to get something from another country, the price difference or the price of transportation can often be significant, or else the price of goods being delivered either to, again, a supermarket or delivered to your home. Now, obviously, the more distance a good has to travel, the more, in theory, the price should increase, and this will obviously affect the quantity demanded by consumers. So I'm not sure if I will quiz you on that, because this is really basic, but if I ask you to express through a figure the relationship between the quantity demanded and distance, I would expect something as basic as that. Okay? Now, something that the sort of supply and demand answer, the sort of, supply and demand graph answer that economic geographers have is something called central place theory. And the assumption here are as follows, and again, I don't really like those simple models, so the chances that you'll be quizzed on them are kind of low, but again, this is straight from the textbook. So the real price and cost of a good increases with the distance between the seller and the consumer. The marketing principle dictates that people try to minimize the distance traveled to obtain the goods. So if you're gonna buy milk and milk is the same place everywhere, well, obviously you'll go to a supermarket closer rather than further away from where you live. There's only so much you're willing to travel for certain types of goods, so the maximum distance that consumer will travel to obtain a good is called the range. And there are also a number of thresholds, so the number of consumers necessary for a good to be viable, and the threshold population must exist within the range of a good. Now again, you were born and raised in an environment in which you can live in the middle of nowhere and buy stuff online. This is a relatively recent development. It used to be that not too long ago, you wanted to buy a car, you were pretty much limited to the dealerships in your neighborhood. And if you were living in a small town, well, you had to commute to a bigger city to buy a car because a village of 800 people would obviously not support a car dealership. So economic geographers are also in the habit of making simplifying assumptions. Typically we talk about a homogeneous plane, uniformly distributed consumers. They all want to minimize distance for a good, and assuming that everything else is equal, then we can see how economic activities organizes itself over geographical space. We also assume that there are a number of rivals who will enter the market area to serve available demand. So if you want to buy ice cream on a beach, for example, unless there's a monopoly granted to an ice cream salesperson, chances are that if there is enough demand, there will be more than one person willing to sell you ice cream. Now, assuming that the beach is flat and that the people being in the water or whatever are distributed uniformly, where will each ice cream salesperson position himself or herself? Now this leads us to basic geometry tricks. I'm not going to get into that. So people often criticize economists for making assumptions, using simplifying maths to represent complex human behavior. Geographers are not really better. We like to make hexagons because this is the sort of optimal form to explain the distribution of economic activity. I mean, I'm not really going to delve into that. We have more advanced economic geography course where you can have a sort of geometrical demonstration why this is so. But again, there are logical places for people to occupy on the beach if you want to sell ice cream or if you want to produce certain types of goods. So we will look at real world examples later this semester. I will spare you the basic theory, which is fine in the abstract, but I believe these principles will be more concrete when we discuss the real world. One thing, though, that I will ask you to remember, this is from the book, but I will probably have a question based on table 1.1, is that you've got different kinds of agglomerations. You've got the big metropolitan area, let's say something like the Greater Toronto area. You've got, within the Greater Toronto area, places like Mississauga or Scarborough that each have their own little downtown. And if you drive further north, you will see smaller towns throughout the landscape. And if you go to a more rural area, let's say a region that produces primarily agricultural goods, you will see that there is one town that is more important than the other, and this is where typically the Walmart or other big retailers will be located. So in order to make this a bit more concrete, we can look at the banking industry in Canada or in the GTA. So if you go to downtown Toronto, you will see the 4 headquarters of the main Canadian banks located literally next to each other. Now, a headquarters will have a number of functions that you don't find elsewhere. This is where typically the big bosses are. This is where most of their market research is done. This is where the brand is protected. This is where the operations are managed centrally. This is also typically where the main human resource operation and accounting activities will be located. But if you've worked in the industry or if you have ever looked around you will see other types of operations. So for example, if you drive on the 401 north of here, you will see buildings with bank logos on them, but they're not places where you go to talk to someone from the bank or to get some cash. These are typically other functions which are important, but not important enough to be located downtown. So I'm not exactly sure what they do up here in Toronto, but typically they have backup systems, they have what we call back office operations. They might have people who do customer service, for example, over the phone, or operations of this type. And then anywhere in Canada is your typical branch, where if you don't do your banking completely online, you will go negotiate a mortgage, you'll go get some cash, you can go pay your bills. These are the kind of operations that are found all over the country. So again, there are some locations that will attract some types of function. You will never find the president of a large operation like a bank located in the middle of nowhere, or even in a town like, let's say, Sudbury or Ottawa. Okay, these people need to be close to other important people, and that's why they're located in downtown Toronto, and that's why they were willing to pay more for that particular piece of land than other industries, and that's why they've pushed them out. But it makes sense to locate certain types of operations in a few locations, and then of course what you mainly do is reach out to consumers when you go where the consumers are. So trust me, we could spend a whole semester discussing location theory, but I just want you to understand that there are certain degrees of freedom, but also a number of constraints in terms of where businesses will locate some aspects or some types of operations. Okay, the supply of a good across space, assuming that all things are equal, the closest producers to consumers will have the lower costs in the market. So let's say that you have a fondness for Ontario apples. Well, in theory, an apple producer located in Milton should be able to deliver to Mississauga cheaper than someone who is located closer to Ottawa, let's say. So if you believe that an apple is an apple, or at least a Macintosh is a Macintosh, assuming everything else equal, the producer in Milton should be able to deliver to the farmer's market in Mississauga for a lot less money than the one who is located in the Ottawa Valley. And so as a result of that, well, you tend to consume a certain types of apple, or at least you tend to find a certain types of apple in local farmers market. Now obviously transport costs vary with the distance, but not only the distance. As you will learn later this semester, putting, let's say, a container of apples on a ship and shipping them from New Zealand to Vancouver typically costs a lot less money per apple than putting them on a truck and delivering them from Ottawa to Toronto. A big container ship floats on water, it has huge diesel engines, it's extremely efficient, and boats really don't cost much in terms of moving things around. But boats are slow, they're not so flexible, and they're kind of limited as to where they can go. And so this is why obviously most goods, except a very expensive one that might also travel by airplanes, goods or containers at least typically move between ships, between the railroad, and between trucks. And so all these things will affect transportation costs. You cannot simply assume in the real world that the further away something comes, the more expensive it will be to bring it to where you live. So again, if you live in Vancouver, it often is cheaper to buy stuff that is produced across the Pacific than something similar that might be produced in Alberta. And that's because if the railroad is not available to keep costs down, or if the railroad doesn't want to move certain types of goods because it makes more sense for them to move grain or to move petroleum products, well then it often makes sense to import goods from a greater distance because it will be cheaper. Okay, so other geographically differentiated factor, how many skilled people are available in one location? So one reason why you want to be in downtown Toronto is that you have a lot of smart people in the GTA. You might want to employ those people, and having them commute downtown right next to Union Station is actually very convenient. I assume that most of you, if you don't own a car, know how bad the traffic is in Toronto, and so it often makes more sense if you can to take GO Transit, go downtown, take a short walk from Union Station, and work in a bank than even trying to commute a few kilometers in the wrong direction and being stuck on the 401 or the Don Valley Parkway at rush hour. Taxes, various types of costs will also influence business location. So the authors describe the case of mines. What they do there is that they assume that, imagine that you have a few, let's call them nickel mines or copper mines around the world, that the deposits are all roughly the same quality. Well, if you want copper or if you want iron ore to be delivered to, let's say, Hamilton or Sudbury, then where will you import the stuff from? Well, again, assuming that the mines are roughly the same, then you want the one that is the closest to you, because, again, transportation costs do matter. But again, different types of transportation cost, shipping and railroad in that case will have a different cost structure, and this will affect which mine you do import ore from. Okay, again, I apologize. I know that this is a lot of stuff. This is a bit overwhelming, but most questions will come from the textbook unless otherwise specified. Okay, so I've told you about supply, I've told you about demand, I've told you that businesses will locate different types of operation based on different constraints. What you need to understand is that in a market economy, these things will happen spontaneously. Nobody told whoever was in charge of the biggest Canadian banks to locate at a particular street corner in downtown Toronto. They did that because it made sense. Banks used to be very profitable. These days I'm not so sure. But they could pay more for a particular locations than other lines of work. And so they obviously located in a place that was especially convenient to them. They could have access to skilled labor. They're not far from Bay Street. They're where the action is in the financial sector. And so they spontaneously migrated to that location. But obviously, market coordination involves a huge number of factors and will affect different people differently. So the authors describe, among other things, transaction costs. So you can expect a question on transaction cost. Again, what I will want is just this. So you can look at the textbook. All I've done here is sort of excerpt the relevant concepts. And so transaction costs exist because you need to coordinate your actions with other people. And in most cases, things are not available at the farmer's market where you go and you transact directly with the person. If you look for any specific type of service or for a particular piece of information, well, there's often a search cost associated with that. Just like finding book reviews, you could say finding book reviews is a form of transaction cost. But in the real world, what you need to do is to find the relevant stuff, and not only find the relevant information, but find typically the person or the supplier that will be the most useful, or at least the most cost efficient in your case. And so you need to spend time, money, to either pay people to look for things, or perhaps even to dispatch people to look at various types of tuna that show up one morning at the Tsukiji market, or else to assess the quality of a few things being produced in different locations. And then it depends on how you decide to look at these things. Now the authors are a bit more, I don't know, I would say the glass half empty perspective than I am. What they emphasize is that some people have some advantages over other people in terms of knowing what is good, where is the best stuff located. But for me, it's just the cost of doing business. I mean, if you want to get into a particular line of work, if you're looking for a particular item, it might be that somebody who's already in the market knows more than you do, but it is up to you to make up for this discrepancy in information and to either build your sales force or to hire people who actually know about these things. And over time, if you're any good, you will be able to catch up with your competitor. But the authors are of a more pessimistic perspective, and they say, well, markets are unfair, therefore something should be done about this. So depending on your perspective, transaction costs are a good thing. or transaction costs, I'm sorry, are a necessary thing or they're a bad thing. Some of them anyway. Okay, so again, I apologize for the amount of information. There'll be more videos soon. So, how do markets organize to reduce transaction costs? Well, you might be part of the solution one day. You might become knowledgeable about a particular market. You might get to know people. You might be on top of trends or of recent product. And it might be that you will either work for somebody else or you will be self-employed acting as a consultant. And in some cases, somebody who enters a market doesn't know something about one particular dimension of it. Typically, what you do is hire a consultant who knows about that. And for an overall reasonable fee, yes, the individual person might be paid a lot, but in the grander scheme of running your business, the cost is not so enormous. You might be able to hire someone who's knowledgeable and might help you reduce your transaction costs. But in the real world, again, this is only one way to do this. You can be located to your suppliers and your customers and get your feedback that way. You can build trust with some suppliers or people who will want to work with you to help you overcome some problems. And there are other ways to deal with transaction costs. I'm not going to get into the details here. They're all fairly intuitive. And at any rate, we'll get back to them in more detail when we discuss real-world cases. Okay, now you can pretty much expect a question on that particular slide. It's kind of a summary of what the authors are trying to tell you about the different types of markets. So there is the ideal perfect competition model, but obviously this is not characteristics of all markets. And so what the authors want to introduce you to is that, well, there are markets where people often collaborate rather than compete with each other, and there are markets in which people, even though they don't belong to the same organization, will often work together over the long run. And so they distinguish between open markets, relational markets, and hierarchical markets. So open market is, again, something like the Japanese fish market that I showed you. You have spot markets, public auctions. A spot market is where something will be transacted and delivered the same day. So there are a few locations around the world where you can actually buy petroleum if you want to, and you buy it and you get it delivered the same day. Relational markets are typically the type of markets in which a business will subcontract, but instead of collaborating with the suppliers, will essentially position them against each other and go with the lowest bidder or higher quality or whatever it is that you want to get. And there are hierarchical markets in which you have one dominant player, a bunch of suppliers, but their relationship in that case is more one of collaboration and let's all try to grow together, as opposed to the sort of cutthroat competition that one purchaser might have with different suppliers. So the incentives for competition are obviously different in each case. Competition is more intense when you have people bidding over tuna than when you collaborate with suppliers over the long run to deliver better car parts, for example. And all of these markets, or all these different types of markets, are important to delivering the clothes that you wear, the car that you drive, the food that you eat. And so markets are different, but ultimately they're all based on supply and demand, people coordinating activities in different ways. So again, make a note, 3 different types of market. I should have written down the figure number here, but you can expect a question on this. Okay, open markets. So we're not talking a perfect competition model, but the closest thing to it that you will have in the real world. The proximity to consumers and sellers reduce the search and comparison costs for both. And the internet these days allows us to be much closer to the perfect competition model than was the case a number of years ago. So I'm kind of a bit embarrassed to say this, but I took my first formal economics class 30 years ago. And in those they were all, well, what's the only thing that comes close to a competitive market, a perfect competition? And the answer was a farmer's market at 10 to 5 when the market closes at 5. Then producers are desperate to sell their stuff. They don't want to bring anything back home. You still have a few consumers, you still have a few products to sell. And this, according to my professor back then, was the closest thing to a perfect market. But these days, of course, you can go online, you can do comparison shopping, you can bid on stuff. And so the world has changed, and the perfect competition model is not as irrelevant as it was 30 years ago. Now, another example that we would use back when I was young was a shopping mall. It was not as perfect as the other example that I gave you, but you know, you want to buy clothes of various kinds. Well, you go to a shopping mall, at least you have a few retail outlets that will compete with each other. But again, you live in an age where the perfect competition model doesn't seem as silly as it looked 30 years ago. Okay, administered or hierarchical markets. So you have a vertical or internally integrated exchange coordinating a division of labor. So there's really some big player there and a bunch of suppliers. Firms may benefit by reducing costs and uncertainty instead of using open markets. So if you want to have some stability, you don't want to bid, you know, if you need to buy, I don't know, pens or notebooks or iPads or whatever, it doesn't make sense to go out and bid on these items every time. So that's why a few retail outlets or websites or organizations have emerged, because having a few of those where you can still comparison shop between them is relevant. It's in order to reduce transaction costs. It doesn't make sense to bid for everything that you buy. And so having a few suppliers, but bidding them against each other still makes sense. So a standard example of this, or at least the one that has probably been used the most in the last decade or two, would be, for example, Nike's supply chain. So the design of your Nike clothes, for example, is still mostly done in Oregon at the headquarters of Nike. But let's face it, you know, producing shorts or T-shirts is not all that difficult. So you can insist on the type of fabric you want, the color, the design, whatever. You can make these things known to a number of people who have the manufacturing capacity to deliver the product, and you let them bid with each other, and you go with the lowest bidder, or at least the best bidder. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any other problems involved in having a supply chain like that, but you get the basic idea. Another thing that sort of comes close to that is when you can, again, shop between different supermarkets. Let's say that you have time to shop orange juice and you want to see, well, it was Oasis on sale this week. Well, that's not exactly the same thing, but you get the idea. But you can also have Walmart, who will have a bunch of suppliers and will have them bid, let's say, to produce orange juice for their no-name brand. So you're not aware of where your orange juice comes from, but you know it is cheaper, and you trust that Walmart will maintain a certain standard of quality. Okay, relational markets, they're a hybrid form of open and administered market. In that case, again, what is different is the long-term stable relationships between one large organization and its suppliers. Now, these markets mostly emerge because having everything under one roof leads to real complicated bureaucracy problems. And so some large firms will have many suppliers because it makes sense to have decentralized units rather than having one big bureaucracy managing everything. Introduces more flexibility, reduces transaction costs in a way. But at the same time, you're not just playing your suppliers against each other. You build a relationship with them. And often what you see is that it makes sense for suppliers to move closer to their main customer, who's also their partner, not just a bigger player that buys stuff from them. So as you know, cars are made up of many parts. These are typically not made by whichever company sells you a car. So the suppliers to the 2014 Toyota Tundra, so companies known as North American Lighting, Eagle, Arada, Gerdex, Stables, NASCO, Koyo. So again, these are companies that supply parts to Toyota, but they're typically in a long-term relationship with the company because they all want to improve the quality of the product. They're all in this together, even though they don't formally belong to the same organization. That's another description of this. Increasingly, what you see is that suppliers also work with each other, not just the big company. Bear with me, guys. There's a fun video coming up in 2 minutes. These are parts. Okay, come on, guys. If you want to chat, there's a Tim Horton out there. So, in that context, you also have value chains. So now that you understand, or if you didn't already know, that one company will have many suppliers the world over, the way we describe those are value chains that are a set of interrelated activities and markets, and they're typically a combination of all the types of markets described so far. Now, value chains are of special interest to geographers, but what I want to emphasize here is that they're often much more complex than people realize, and even simple products are the result of many more transactions than you can imagine. So I've actually found a video of another professor who actually manages to make value chain not only interesting, but also somewhat funny. So I thought you would be better off listening to him than to me.
Welcome to Supply Chain Management. Now, I know most of you have spent your childhood evenings dreaming of taking your first Supply Chain Management course. But for those handful of you who might not know what Supply Chain Management is, let me provide you a brief explanation. Let's take a simple product, like a bottle of water. Clean water, a plastic bottle, a plastic cap, and a label. Buying them at the store or vending machine might cost you about $1.50. How much of that do you think is profit? Nope. Wrong. Wrong again. Not likely. Water. A plastic bottle and a label. That couldn't cost more than 50 cents. And if you buy them in bulk, how could each bottle not give you at least $1 in profit? Seriously. If you think you can make $1 per bottle, you should drop out of college right now and get into the bottled water business. You see, this right here illustrates one of the most common consumer misconceptions. Product cost is not equal to material cost. And in business, you don't have the luxury of thinking only as a consumer. You need to think like a business executive, or better yet, an entrepreneur. So, in order to figure out where all that profit went, we need to imagine what it took for that bottle of water to get into your hands. First, you need to negotiate the purchase of the empty bottles and caps. Those bottles will be much easier to transport if they're in boxes. We'll need to shrink wrap those bottles so they don't fall out of the box. We can move a whole lot of boxes quickly if they're all put on pallets. In order to move the pallets, you'll need a forklift, which means you'll need a forklift driver. That forklift will then take the pallet and put it into a truck, which will require a truck, driver, fuel, and insurance. Also, you'll need a label for that bottle of water. Therefore, you need to design the label, print the label, and get the label shipped to the plant. Another truck, driver, more fuel, and insurance. Our water bottling plant won't be free, and neither will the energy it uses. In our bottling plant, we'll have employees and bottling machines, and let's not forget the day-to-day items like light bulbs, garbage bags, machine parts, janitorial supplies, toilet paper, and anything else that will be used at the plant by the employees. Oh yeah, and we'll also need access to the drinking water. Machines will then purify the water. Other machines will bottle the water and affix the labels to the bottles. And still, another set of machines will box, shrink wrap, and then palletize the bottles. In order to move those pallets, again, you'll need a forklift, which means we'll need another forklift driver. That forklift will then take the pallets and put them into trucks headed to the distribution centers. And, as we've seen, those trucks will require drivers, fuel, and insurance. Those distribution centers will also require employees, forklifts, and energy. From the distribution center, they'll head out to retail stores on still another truck, which will require a driver, fuel, and insurance. That store will need employees to unload the truck, stock the bottles of water on the shelf or refrigerator. If you have a refrigerator, you'll of course need energy. If we want to secure our stock, we may get a security guard or a security system. And of course, the store will likely get insurance. Also, imagine the costs associated with returning and replacing bottles that are damaged. Oh, and for some reason, even bottles of water sometimes have 1-800 numbers, which means you'll need a staffed call center to answer the customer's questions about your bottle of water. Wow! All those materials, boxes, people, machines, buildings, energy, fuel, and vehicles, they cost money. Those things weren't free, and they probably weren't used efficiently, and it's likely that several bottles didn't survive the journey to the consumer. Oh, and by the way, the employees at the water company, you know, the ones that work in finance, accounting, marketing, human resources, and IT, they want a paycheck too. So, through that simple example of a super simple product, we're beginning to see that companies face challenges when they buy things, make things, move things, sell things, and service things, which includes repair and maintenance. Oh, and let's not forget, companies need to do all these things using sustainable materials, energy, and methods. Guess whose job it is to make sure that all these things happen flawlessly, with minimal effort, and of course at minimal cost? You guessed it, supply chain managers. The supply chain manager needs to be able to do all of these things. They need to give the customer the product they want, when they want it, as often as they want it, for a reasonable price, while still managing to make a profit. This requires world-class skills and knowledge in the study of supply chain management. There's that scary term again, supply chain management. Let me try to make it friendlier by shuffling around the words. There you go. The management of the chain of supplies. For some reason, that just seems a whole lot easier to understand, doesn't it? But it also helps us understand the complex nature of supply chain management. I mean, the management of the chain of supplies. Now let's think of other products and what their supply chains might encompass. Hamburgers, sweaters, coffee, tables, cars, and airplanes? Now I know many of you are saying, but I live in a service economy. I won't be manufacturing anything. Wrong again. As of 2008, the US was still the #1 exporter of manufactured goods. Okay, maybe not for long. So let's talk about service economy supply chains. Let's think of something you're probably familiar with, the hotel industry. What do hotels manufacture? Lodging experiences, dining experiences, spa experiences, which all together make up vacation and conference experiences. In order to do all of these things effectively and efficiently, what's required? Hotels need to buy things like beds, furniture, televisions, cable, food, soaps, towels. They also make things, or in this case, manufacture services, like housekeeping, meals, massages, and special events. Hotels also move things, like transporting clean towels and food to and from the rooms, as well as transporting guests and their luggage to and from the airport. They even sell things, like in-room movies, internet services, and tickets to events. And finally, they also provide services, such as making reservations, organizing events, making wake-up calls, and even cleaning and pressing clothes. Once again, we see that the fundamental skills learned in supply chain management can be used to manufacture service experiences as much as they aid in manufacturing products. Well, I hope that this has given you an idea of what supply chain management is all about. You see, this is the reason why little kids all around the world want to be supply chain managers. They want to take part in manufacturing the best products and services on earth. So again, welcome to supply chain management, where all of your childhood supply chain dreams are about to come true.
Okay, again, so I have a number of colleagues ways, and I'm not saying bad things here, we often like to point out, well, you know, the coffee producer only receives like 3 or 4% of the total value, or 5%. Isn't it unfair? All this profit is going elsewhere. You know, when people say things like that, they typically mean well, but they don't understand all the different steps that are typically included in manufacturing stuff and what value chains are about. Which is why an economic geography course might be useful to help you see the bigger picture rather than just say, well, there's a producer of coffee who gets paid that much, and then you pay that much at Starbucks or at Tim or whatever. There are reasons why things are priced, and ultimately when they're based on voluntary transactions, there's rarely someone who gets a huge profit at the end of the day. You have a number of intermediary steps that are all necessary that need to be paid for. Okay, so you've got these value chain in every industry. You've got these supply chains in every industry. So even at the example of the fish market that I was giving you before, you've got regional markets, you've got fishery cooperative, trading companies, shippers, brokers, auctioneers, the live auction, the negotiated sales. There are a number of intermediaries there, and most of them, again, if it is a competitive market economy where you're not forced to transact with people, most of these people add value, even if it's not obvious to you. Otherwise, nobody would pay for them on a voluntary basis if they were not getting something that they deem worth the investment. Okay. So if I ask you a quick question about supply chain management, I'll have to think about it, but I wanted you to see the video anyway. The point is that why isn't anybody just packaging a bottle of water for $1.50 when buying the things separately or different? Well, you need to scale up operations, and this is where all these other costs come through, or at least cannot be avoided. Okay, now obviously markets are not taking place in a vacuum. You have people who produce, you have people who sell, but you've got a bunch of regulators, you've got political institutions, you have activists who expect firms to change their behavior or to at least do things in a way that they might be more sustainable or more fair to workers. But you also have formal institutions that underlie the production of goods. Now, if I had more time, and if one of you dared to sit on the front row, I would typically grab the laptop and walk away with it, and then try to start a conversation with you. Well, why is it unfair? Why did I grab the laptop? Why is it? Why is your professor, person doing that? Well, you would typically answer, well, because I've paid for it. What did you pay for? Well, it's mine. I want to use it. I don't want to give it to you. Well, why would we come to have goods that we pay for that are ours and that are not other people? And why does it matter? You know, will you buy a laptop if your professor randomly every week decides to take one away from you? Well, obviously not. The same is true for everything else that you do in life. If you're not secure in the ownership of what you use to earn a living or to build your house or what have you, if these things can be taken away from you, well, you obviously don't have any incentive to be a productive market participant, which is why historically, whenever the rights to own something isn't clear, whenever whatever is produced can be taken by somebody more powerful than you, then obviously you have very little economic development occurring. So more on property rights this week and a little bit the next. But the point is that there really hasn't been any functioning market economy in the past that wasn't based on clear and well-defined property rights. If you don't own the stuff, you won't really have an incentive to take care of it and to invest and to think long term. Okay, so property rights, you can expect a question on this, and this is what I will expect you to answer me. They're fundamental to market economies, but as the author pointed out, they're a relatively recent social invention. They're codified by law. They're respected and monitored informally. It's not like there's a security agent at the door that would prevent me from taking your laptop. It's just, you know, we have conventions by which we abide, and you don't expect your professor to take your stuff. Now, obviously, things vary from place to place, but the basic notion of ownership is understood by basically all humans, but also many animal species like dogs, for example. Dogs are very territorial, and this is their stuff, this is their territory, other dogs are not welcome on them. Humans take property rights to a next level, but they're by no means the only species that have property rights. But again, this is a topic that we will revisit a few times. How many of you are familiar with the tragedy of the commons? Okay, most of you are not, which I find sad every year. So why did property rights emerge? Well, there were a few good reasons for that, and I believe, even though this is not in the textbook, that this is worth visiting.
The tragedy of the commons is a concern among biologists and social scientists alike. I'd rather refer to this as the problem of open access resources. In short, the tragedy of the commons occurs because each user receives direct benefit of using the resource, but only bears a fraction of the cost of its exploitation. So examples abound. I mean, it could be African elephants that are near extinction. It could be Amazon rainforest deforestation. It could be overfishing of many of the fisheries worldwide. It could be overfishing in the pond, say, right here. The idea behind this has been around for many years, but Garrett Hardin in his 1968 piece in Science was the first to bring this to the forefront about the time that the environmental movement began planning its first Earth Day. In Garrett Hardin's example, he presents us with an open access pasture. Anyone who wants to can bring their cattle to graze. Each rancher's goal is to maximize his or her private benefit. Every rancher has the incentive to bring more and more cattle to the pasture because they receive the direct benefit of grazing their cattle there. Unfortunately, they only bear a fraction of the cost of the overexploited pasture. So they're going to continue to add cow after cow until the pasture is overgrazed and destroyed and no longer usable as pasture land. In other words, their individual incentive invites overall ruin. For even though if they recognize that the pasture is being exploited, somebody else will bring a cow if they don't. And so they'll continue to do so. It's not that they don't know the asset's being exploited, it's that if they wait and try to delay, it'll just be exploited by somebody else. The large issue here is there's a lack of excludability. The ranchers have no way of stopping others from adding cattle to the pasture. In his piece, Garrett Hardin suggested two main ways to go about solving the tragedy of the commons. The first is through privatization or private ownership. The second is through public ownership or government ownership. So whenever we have public ownership, one of the benefits is that we still all share the collective rights to this asset. This is one of the reasons why we have the national park system to protect natural open space at Yosemite and the beauty of Yellowstone and things of that nature. But one of the problems with public ownership is that the decision makers don't bear the cost of their actions, nor do they receive additional value from any good decisions they make. For instance, imagine if you're a park ranger and you find some innovative way to reduce large forest fires that adds value to the park itself. You don't receive the direct benefit of your decisions. You and your staff are not going to receive large pay raises or are not going to receive the large stream of value that comes from that decision. However, private ownership does solve this problem. With private ownerships, the decision maker bears the direct cost of their actions. And so, for any poor decision, they're going to bear the costs of. But any positive, innovative decision, they'll receive the benefits. So if you were a ranger or a park owner who'd have found this innovative way to solve the problem with forest fires, then you would receive the stream of value from that good decision. There's not a silver bullet to the problem of open access resources. There's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. But we do know that limiting access and ensuring that decision makers bear the costs of their actions allows us to address key concerns with open access resource problems.
Okay, so limiting access, making sure that innovators are rewarded, according to this fellow, are the keys to solving the tragedy of the commons. Now, this being said, as he was pointing out, and he was too kind, the guy who wrote the famous article, Hardin, was a biologist and really didn't know much about the topic. He really should have called this article The Tragedy of Open Access. Commons have existed for a very long time. They were typically fields that were owned by all the villagers in one part of the world. And villagers were not stupid. They understood the basic problem, which is why, while the property was held in common, they would typically limit the number of cows that would be allowed on the pasture. But cow was determined according to customs or whatever mechanism they might have. So what Garrett Arden, the fellow who's now mostly associated with the tragedy of the commons, was describing was really the tragedy of open access, where nobody or no one can limit the access to a given resource. Okay, so stuff that will be that you'll be quizzed on that is not in the textbook. How did American rangers solve the problem of common access historically? Well, the first step that they did when you would have a bunch of cattle grazing the landscape was to make sure that everyone recognized their own cows. I mean, their own steer, their own beef cattle. And so what they used to do at first was to brand them. So you would take a hot iron and you would mark the animal. So while you still might have too many cattle, too much livestock on the prairies, at least you knew which ones were yours. So brands at least allowed people to at least identify which which animal belongs to which ranger. But there is a lesson here. If you ever drive in the United States and you hit a grazing cow, the consequences might be different. Pretty much east of the Mississippi, eastern part of the United States, if a cow walks on the road and you hit it, the cow owner is responsible for the damage. But if you go to the states that historically had livestock grazing freely, if you hit a cow, then you're responsible. That's because the rangers were there first and they made sure that the law was on their side. So if you ever drive in Montana, Wyoming, or these parts of the United States and you bump into a cow, well, it's your fault. Whereas if you drive in Virginia and you bump into a cow, it is the cow's owner's fault. Okay, so branding obviously evolved over time. Today we don't, and even though there's no more open access tragedy today, the way you brand cows is by putting a little plastic tag in their ears. But what really solved the problem historically was the invention of barbed wire. Barbed wire was very cheap to produce, very easy to install, and so the American prairie, American grasslands were divided among owners that way. And so the tragedy of the common for rangers was eventually solved by either privatizing the land or at least fencing the land between the land that belonged to the state and the one that belonged or was leased by particular individuals. And so technology often solves problems like the tragedy of the commons. And the most compelling example historically was the development of barbed wires over grassland. Okay. Now, the worst tragedy of open access today is arguably the open ocean. Now, the thing here is that if you want to fish close to the shores of most countries, typically within 250 miles, the ocean floor, the ocean there, typically belongs to a particular nation state or a particular island, and various rules can be enforced. And so what they have, for example, in parts of the United States, like in Alaska, is that they have bidding in terms of how much fish can be caught in a particular body of water. But once you go beyond that and you're into the open sea, then the resources that are found there don't belong to anyone. And so obviously fisheries have been threatened for years because the resources don't belong to anyone in particular. Now there have been two answers to that. One is the development of fish farming. So most of the salmon that you buy today is not wild salmon, but salmon that was raised in fish farms. This is not to say that there are not problems with that, but at least the supply has increased, and so most of the fishes that you find in supermarkets today, most of the fish that is eaten the world over now comes from fish farms. But then other technologies have been developed. So for example, tuna, as you know, are very valuable fishes. And in that case, well, you cannot fence the ocean. One solution has been to fence the tuna. So you have these huge nets in the ocean where you put little baby tunas, and you move that around, the tunas can eat whatever gets through their net, but they cannot escape from it. And so in that case, you have a fencing solution, except that you sort of move the fence, you move your tuna school around the Mediterranean or parts of the Pacific Ocean. So in that case, well, you cannot fence the ocean, you can fence the tuna, and you move the tuna around. And tuna are valuable enough to be produced that way. So again, there's a problem, but there are also often solutions. But this being said, there are still significant problems with open access fisheries today. So if anyone is interested in reviewing a book on the topic, how can we deal with open access fisheries, I'm happy to make a few suggestions. This is actually an interesting topic, or interesting to me anyway. Other ways to deal with resources are often traditional customs. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term lobster gangs. I'm from Quebec. A lot of people spend their summer in Maine, or they might have heard the expression. And basically what happened is that while no individual in particular has formal ownership of a body of water close to shore, fishermen have agreed among themselves that, you know, this spot belongs to this particular person, this other spot belongs to something else. And the expression lobster gangs comes from the fact that if you want to go fish lobster there, you can expect a gang of fishermen to show up with baseball bats, rifles, or whatever to get you out of there. They don't formally have ownership of that particular piece of water, but customs among themselves has emerged, and there is this understanding among local fishermen that a particular spot belongs to someone. And if they don't do that, chances are that lobsters would have been gone a long time ago. In the textbook, they discussed the case of tuna fishermen in northern Japan. In that case, were not very successful at trying to establish a similar system. But again, customs among local communities often find ways to deal with tragedies of the commons that way. Okay, another problem. This is the last video I will show you, and I'll let you go over this. So if you want to leave, I'll let you leave now, but at least don't bother those who want to stay. A problem in Canada that we have, and something that a number of us are rightfully ashamed of, is the state of native reservations. Why is it that in a country as wealthy as Canada, a number of people struggle to escape poverty, and why do native reservations look the way they do? Is it because people there are not as good as we are, or is there something else at work? And the video I'll present you is that the case that they make is that there is something else at work there, and they also suggest solutions.
Look at this place, a big public park.
It's a big space where anyone can come. No one person owns this. Everyone shares it.
Sharing is caring, it can be fun.
It feels good, just like this children's song makes you feel good about sharing.
Sharing is caring, it can be fun.
And when I asked,
What's better, public or private?
most people said,
Well, obviously public.
If it were private, they'd probably charge you a fee for looking.
Wouldn't you say public? Otherwise we wouldn't be here right now, right?
But wait, is that true?
supermarkets are private, so are churches, but both are more accessible to the public than, say, public schools. Also, public sometimes isn't very nice.
What comes to mind when you hear the words public toilet?
Oh, well, that's gross. That's gross.
Yes, this is the image I have of public toilets. And my town's public parks, including this one, used to look gross too. Garbage everywhere, buildings covered with graffiti, fields bare of grass.
Sharing is not necessarily caring. Sharing can mean neglect. But then, why is this park now so nice? Because it's under new management, private management.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, it's interesting.
But that goes against what people expect.
This is actually a privately managed park.
Really? I did notice last week when I was here, they have awesome toilets.
Yes, even the toilets are better.
Great toilets, because they clean it very nicely.
Because when you own something, you take care of it. When no one owns it, nobody takes care of it.
Nobody washes a rental car. People destroy other common property, like much of the world's rainforests. American settlers nearly killed all the buffalo. Now we're overfishing the oceans.
When everyone owns a resource, no one really cares about it. No one really takes care of it. It's called the tragedy of the commons.
We like the idea of sharing, communal property, but it does lead to what economists call the tragedy of the commons. It's a tragedy because nasty things happen when everyone owns something. I first heard that phrase in a story about some shepherds who lived around a grassy area they called a commons. Since all the shepherds shared this free green grass, they grabbed as much of it as possible. They kept breeding sheep and bringing many more sheep to graze, but soon all the grass was gone. The sheep died, and the shepherds had nothing. So then they divided the commons into parcels. Now each shepherd owned one. Each had an incentive to limit the number of sheep that grazed on his grass. Prosperity happened, and everyone lived happily ever after. Have you ever been to an Indian reservation? If you have, you probably saw serious poverty and alcoholism and drug abuse. Is it because there's something about Indians that makes them lazy or irresponsible? No. When Indians own their own land, they do about as well as other Americans. Manny Jules wants to see more of that. He was chief of the Kamloops Indian Band in Canada for 16 years. Manny, why are so many Indians so poor?
Well, first of all, John, nobody chooses poverty. One of the things that's happened is we've been legislated out of the economy by the federal governments, both in the United States and Canada.
What do you mean they've been taking care of you? That sounds like the best deal.
By taking care of us, that means providing social welfare programs. The only way to break the cycle of poverty, I believe, is by the recognition that every other Canadian and American takes for granted, and that's real property rights.
So in Canada, as in much of the U.S., reserves are owned by the government.
Yes.
So the Indian has some piece of paper that says, this is my lot.
But underlying that title is the fact that in Canada, the federal government owns the land.
So you can't borrow against it.
You can't borrow, you can't get a mortgage, you can't be bonded. There's nothing that you can have that'll allow you to be able to go to the bank on your own without the minister co-signing that loan.
Let's bring another guest from PERC, economist Terry Anderson, into this. Terry, you find Indians do much better when they own their own land.
Yes, John. I first got interested in this subject in 1976 when I visited a member of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And while visiting his house, I noted just how well off he was. He was not in poverty, and I asked, how do you explain this? And I'll never forget him leaning across the table, resting his chin on his hand and elbow, saying, I own this place. And that was my first introduction to the fact that many reservations in the United States do have some fee simple land, that is privately owned land like you and I own our houses. And the Indians that have privately owned land do much, much better. Their land is way more productive than the land that is overseen by the federal government, held in
40
trust.
to 90% more productive, you found.
Yes, the statistics are just astounding. I've done a lot of gathering of those data, and they show that fee simple lands are anywhere from 40 to 90% more productive than the lands held in trust. And as Manny said, these Indians who have their land under the trusteeship of the federal government can't borrow against them. They are really locked into a poverty cycle as a result.
Now, I want to introduce you to one of the most impressive people I know. I first met him maybe 15 years ago. It was one of those lunches with some economist from South America, had some ideas about solving poverty. I go to lunches like that because it bugs me that...
Okay, so we might discuss that next week, but I'll let you go now. If you want to talk to me, instead of having business hours today because the traffic is so bad, I would rather have you talk to me now rather than walk back to my office. So I'll stay here for another 10, 15 minutes. One thing I perhaps did not emphasize enough last week is that when you want to submit a book, please send me a link to the Amazon website or the book publisher so that I can get a sense of what you want to do. So I'll keep posting questions. Don't wait at the last minute to contact Andrew if you need help, or I'm happy to make suggestions if you let me know what you're interested in. So I'll see you next week. Or now.